As I sit here in the midst of nature, let me share a few thoughts about Memorial Day, which today is. Um, I actually have a fairly close relative who died in World War II. My maternal grandfather perished in the Battle of Hurtgen Forest near the end of the war, sometime late 1944. So my mother grew up. He died when she was like 2 or 3, so she grew up not knowing, not really remembering her father, and so that's what Memorial Day is for, as opposed to Veterans Day, which is supposed to commemorate everybody who's ever served. Memorial Day is supposed to be about those who made the ultimate sacrifice, and that was my grandfather. Um, Now, did my grandfather or anybody, any of the schnooks, the poor schnooks who were dragged into that slaughter, uh, that was the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, which was kind of like, as I understand it, kind of like an Omaha Beach kind of situation where the men were just going off and just getting cut down immediately, and you really had no chance unless you happened to be lucky enough to be in the back of the herd or something like that. Um, just huge, huge losses. Uh, did any of the men who fought in that war, did any of them envision the world we have today? If any of them had seen America or the West in 2022, would any of them say, uh, that's what we fought for? No, of course not. And that's why when I sometimes hear people, saying, you know, people uh, who are adherents of NS ideology, saying the wrong side won the war, and we uh, things would have turned out totally differently if the war had been won by the Axis powers instead of by the Allies. Uh, well, at the time, nobody on either side foresaw this kind of world. I can say that pretty confidently. That even the Roosevelts and the even the string pullers on the Allied side. Even if Roosevelt intentionally allowed the Japanese to bomb Pearl Harbor, and I'm pretty sure that he must have done something like that. I have little doubt that happened, although I haven't really looked into it that much. But that kind of skullduggery is just endemic amongst people like Roosevelt. High ranking movers and shakers, power brokers. People who run things. So I have little doubt that it happened, and uh, but there's also no telling that even if the war had gone the other way, I mean, uh, and are we really putting our eggs in that basket? Are we really going to say no? Well, the degeneracy which found a foothold, in the late '60s or mid '60s. I guess I would date it back to the invention of the pill, but also to the introduction of mass immigration, which that's really like the mid '60s or thereabouts. Um, we're talking a good 20 years after the end of the war. Uh, Nobody who was fighting for the Allies thought we're fighting for transgender rights, we're fighting for gay marriage, we're fighting for the the ability for 8-year-olds to discover pornography on the internet, uh, and for the same 8-year-olds to have the right to change their to change their gender. These ideas just were not out there at that time. It was not. It was not what anyone was talking about. So did the wrong side win? it was not a Manichaean battle between good and evil. Let's just put it that way. Um, I will go along with anyone who makes that observation. It's not a good thing that the Soviet Union, that Stalin gained a huge foothold after the end of the war, and that was mostly because Roosevelt was so partial to Uncle, quote unquote, Uncle Joe, that he gave all of Eastern Europe to him. That was not a great thing. Was the world more free, generally speaking, after the end of at the end of the war? I don't know. I really don't think so. Um, you know, there was a new flavor of totalitarian ideology that was around. Um, but even those who equate Soviet communism with today's leftism, that wasn't even. I mean, you've got to have a more expansive understanding and understand that the battlegrounds of today were not the battlegrounds of the ideological, battlegrounds of 1945. Soviet communism was a repressive ideology, terrible ideology to live under, but it wasn't like the leftism of today. The Stalinists were not pushing degeneracy. Very, very much the opposite, in fact. Which doesn't mean that Stalinism is good, because they were anti-degeneracy, because they were evil, they were repressive, they were killing people left and right. They were it was a deeply oppressive system. So my poor grandfather, um, who I think volunteered out of a sense of duty. He was in a military family. His father was a colonel in the military, and he and his brother both, joined up because they felt like they had to, because they wanted to, because it was expected of them, and they didn't want to shirk their duty to country as they saw it. But what did he get? What did he and so many others get in exchange? I mean, they got the privilege of being led to certain death. Uh, the generals, leading the little grunts into pushing their chess pieces, saying, let's push them, put them in this spot and this spot and this spot, and we can handle heavy casualties, just so long as our position holds, and blah blah blah. Yeah, it was a mistake. The entire thing was a mistake. Uh, there's plenty of blame to go around for it, um, just like there is for every war. And I would say there are times when going to war is necessary. There are times when you have a duty to fight. If you've been invaded, and your sovereign land has been taken over, um, by the enemy, who threatens to enslave your family and your neighbors and so forth, then of course that's a situation where you've got to fight. You've got to fight in that kind of situation. World War II was that kind of situation. Certainly not for American GIs. Um, there was no attack on the U.S. proper, other than Pearl Harbor, which was, again, an engineered event in all likelihood. America could have stayed out of the war, um, and had suffered no real repercussions. Let the Soviets and the Nazis, fight it out, kill each other in the East, and then at some point, play the role of a treaty broker. That would have been the better thing to do. That would have been the wiser thing to do. that it would have been the morally more upright thing to do rather than callously sacrificing however many hundreds of thousands of men who perished in that war needlessly, just speaking of the United States, one of whom was, of course, my grandfather. And, of course, I guess I should bring this discussion to a close by mentioning the situation today, how there are people who seem determined to push us into World War III, and we've got this not all there man occupying the office of the presidency, who on the one hand is saying that he doesn't want to get into the actual conflict, but on the other hand, there's video of him talking to troops saying, here's the things you're going to see when you're in Ukraine, when you're fighting in Ukraine. Like, what? I think it's important to say that Russia is not my enemy. Russia is not your enemy. That's not to say that Russia is good or to be a Russophile or anything like that. But what we have happening right now in the Balkans is a territorial struggle that's been going on for for decades or centuries. It does not require the involvement of American men or women, I guess, since women are now entitled to fight and die on the battlefield. Though I don't think that really happens that much, but when it does, it deserves to be discussed as well. So anyway, for the same reasons that World War II should have been avoided, but wasn't, but for a false flag, a likely false flag, World War III really needs to be avoided. Those are my thoughts on Memorial Day, 2022, year of our Lord, 2022. And this is a parenthetical observation. It's not really related to Memorial Day or war or anything like that, but isn't it interesting that we live at a time when just about everybody is saying, man, what a sucky time this is. It's not like I remember things back in the 80s, but in the 80s or 90s, there were people who said, man, I wish it was the 50s again. Things were better back then, but then you had people saying, no, it's much better now. It's much better now, Daddy-o, because we've thrown off that repression and we're, the world is. It's much better to be alive in the 80s and have the choices that we have in the 80s instead of the repressive atmosphere that people had to deal with in the 50s. That was how it was framed. The question of, there was lots of 50s nostalgia in the 80s. Back to the Future, the Back to the Future series being, an example of this nostalgia that was out and about at the time. But now, today, in 2022, who's saying, you know what, I'm so glad I live in 2022. It's so good to be alive in the 2020s. I'm glad I'm not in those repressive 1990s. Think of how people had to suffer back then without the internet, without smartphones, without the global elite plotting to enslave us all in plain sight, or however they frame it. Even people on the left, they're not talking about how things are great right now, and that's a real difference between now and even the somewhat recent past. It seems that everyone seems to think it sucks right now, which is interesting. There's not that many people defending the now. like there was in the past when there was this this nostalgia, these nostalgia wars, if you will. Anyway, just a few thoughts as I sit here in my own personal Hurtgen forest, meditating on the death of my grandfather all those many years ago. And what did he die for? Happy Memorial Day.